Hello, I'm Tim Wall, Senior Reporter for Pet Food Industry. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Ask the Pet Food Pro, Fighting Oxidation, Why Antioxidants Are Essential. From Chile to New Zealand, Ireland to Honduras, and coast to coast in the US, welcome to our global audience. Ask the Pet Food Pro connects experts with industry professionals. Ask the Pet Food Pro is brought to you by Pet Food Forum and Pet Food Industry's journalists and editors. Drawing on our combined decades of experience covering the dog, cat, and other pet food markets, you can find our reporting and analysis at petfoodindustry.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our daily newsletter and monthly magazine. Today's discussion focuses on antioxidants and their role in preventing pet food spoilage. Wilbur Ellis Nutrition sponsors this edition of Ask the Pet Food Pro. Our expert guest is Dr. Melissa Weber, Director of Technical Sales and Food Safety, Quality, and Regulatory at Wilbur Ellis Nutrition. Welcome, Melissa, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here today. I'm a little intimidated, though, I'll be honest. I don't necessarily feel like I'm a pro at things, but I did start my career working in meat color chemistry, focused on color oxidation, and had no idea that fast forward 10 or 15 years that I would enter pet food instead of fresh meat, and then I would be back in this oxidation space, looking at it from a rancidity instead of a color chemistry standpoint. So I'm super excited to be here. It's the topic I'm passionate about, and I hope I can share some good insights with you today.
Great, Melissa. Looking forward to it. But before we start the discussion, I do have a few announcements. Audience members, you've all been muted to ensure that everyone can hear and focus on the discussion. I've included many of the questions you all sent in beforehand in our script, but if you have questions during the discussion, please submit those or any comments in the chat box. Please note that this chat is being recorded, so you can access that recording starting in about a week at petfoodforumevents.com. Click on the Ask the Pet Food Pro tab at the top. All right, Melissa, let's start with establishing why pet food companies need to be proactive with antioxidants. So what exactly are antioxidants, and vice versa, what are oxidants?
Yeah, so I'm going to oversimplify this, but ultimately oxidation is when oxygen molecules react with fat, proteins, or other molecules, causing them to break down. So the oxygen is attacking these molecules and causing them to break down into different types of products. And those byproducts are what can lead to rancidity, bad smells, loss of nutrients. There can be changes in color and texture in the pet food. So that's all bad stuff that we don't want to happen to the nutrients that we've designed into our pet food formulations. For the sake of today, I'm primarily going to talk about lipid oxidation, but we'll also touch on some other types of oxidation as well. And the way antioxidants play a role in this is they inhibit or slow down those chemical reactions, which ultimately is preserving the quality of our pet food products to the entirety of their shelf life.
Gotcha. So that's a good overview, but now let's get a little bit more detailed and really look at, on a chemical level. How do antioxidants help maintain the shelf life of pet food products?
Yeah, so I'm going to start by talking about preventative antioxidants. And I compare these, I have a preteen daughter, so I compare this to fights with her. If you let the fight start, it's going to escalate pretty quickly with all those teenage hormones going on. So preventative antioxidants are incredibly important to stop the oxidation process or slow that oxidation process before it ever starts. Because once oxidation starts, it's going to continue pretty rapidly, typically. So there are preventative antioxidants like ascorbic acid and citric acid that will help prevent that initiation by binding oxygen molecules. So taking care of that oxygen before it has time to attack those molecules and start breaking them down, and to bind to things like metal ions, that's referring to like copper or iron, which will catalyze that oxidation process. So we've got these preventative antioxidants that can slow or stop that initiation phase. And then we have the more traditional antioxidants that most of us think about, which are molecules that come in and help stabilize those free radicals that are formed after oxygen has attacked that double bond and created that free radical molecule. And so by doing that and binding up that free radical, it keeps the oxidation process from continuing because I like to think of it as like a domino effect. Once those first free radicals are formed, they're going to just keep attacking other fat molecules like those dominoes falling over. And so the antioxidants will come in and be like a hand, just stopping those dominoes from continuing to fall.
Gotcha. Gotcha. I like your metaphors there, teenagers and dominoes. So one thing you did mention right there was a couple of different antioxidants. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the difference between natural and synthetic antioxidants in pet food.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to start with synthetic. So when we talk about synthetic antioxidants, we're typically referring to things like BHA and BHT. And these molecules, they're designed through a chemical reaction in some sort of industrial process. And I actually like to think of these, I got a lot of analogies, so you may get bored with those today, but I like to think of them as like these engineered superheroes. Because these antioxidants, they're designed to be resistant to things like heat and oxygen, which makes them stronger and longer lasting than some of the natural antioxidants we'll talk about during this conversation. So synthetic, they're chemically engineered in some sort of industrial lab setting. And then we also have natural antioxidants, and these are the compounds that can be extracted from natural sources like plants or oils, or they can potentially be fermented as well. And these are the antioxidants that we consider more clean label sources because they're not something scary that was designed in an industrial chemical process. They're extracted from foods that are very, acceptable to consumers. So those are seen as our more natural solutions. But they come at a bit of a sacrifice. They aren't chemically engineered for that superior resistance to things like heat. And so oftentimes those natural antioxidants will have a little less efficacy than you see with the synthetic compounds. And therefore you have to use them sometimes at higher application rates.
Gotcha. So speaking of natural antioxidants, what are some common natural antioxidants used in pet food formulations?
Yeah, so there's like 4 or 5 that I would say are the most common from a natural antioxidant standpoint. We've got natural mixed tocopherols or our mixed tocopherols, rosemary extract, and green tea extract, I would say are 3 of the most popular. And then we've also got those that are sometimes used in combinations with things like ascorbic acid or citric acid, which will help have synergistic effects in some of those blends. And I'm going to dig a little deeper into this because one thing that I think sometimes gets confused is when we talk about mixed tocopherols, we're specifically talking about the gamma and delta forms of those tocopherols. There's also vitamin E or the alpha form, and that's going to be less effective as an antioxidant. So when we look at mixed tocopherols, we're really looking for that gamma and delta to have the efficacious effect. I love rosemary extract as a natural antioxidant because it's got several different ways that it's acting as a natural antioxidant. It's got compounds like carnosic acid and carnosol, which will help bind those free radicals and stabilize the formulation. And then you've got rosmaric acid, which will help chelate some of those metal ions. And then the other thing that's fantastic about rosemary is it will help by recharging those mixed tocopherols. So rosemary extract can donate some ions to stabilize the mixed tocopherols and help them get more potency. So we a lot of times use rosemary in combination with mixed tocopherols for that synergistic effect.
Gotcha. Kind of get the best of both worlds there. So, speaking of synthetic antioxidants, what are some examples of some of the frequently used synthetic antioxidants in pet foods?
Yep. So there's also a handful of those. I feel like the industry's got a lot of just standards out there from an antioxidant standpoint, which I'll talk about how I think we can innovate on that later. But from a synthetic standpoint, BHA and BHT are probably the most common ones that you're going to see used in rendering proteins or in pet food formulations. Sometimes you'll see those combined with propyl gallate, which can help have a synergistic effect when you use those in mixtures together. The reason BHA and BHT are most commonly used is they're really efficacious. Like if you ask me to stabilize a rendered protein meal, I feel really good about using those because they have very strong efficacy and they're typically resistant to those higher heats so they don't get degraded during the processing or the rendering process. The other synthetic antioxidant that is absolutely fantastic is ethoxyquin, but as an industry, we've really moved away from that one due to some pet health concerns. So really BHA and BHT are the synthetic compounds that you'll most commonly see in the pet food industry.
Gotcha. So you had mentioned rosemary extract and using that in combinations. Could you talk a little bit more about how do plant-based antioxidants like rosemary extract compare to synthetic options in terms of effectiveness or how they can be used synergetically?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I mentioned, like rosemary extract specifically is a bit like that Swiss Army knife when you compare it to even the synthetic compounds because it has several different modes of action that are helping stabilize and reduce and prevent that oxidation process. And they're really good at regenerating things like those mixed tocopherols that get used up over time. And so rosemary is commonly used in combination with things like their mixed tocopherols to have that synergistic effect. But even as great as rosemary is from a natural standpoint, there still is a lack of efficacy compared to those synthetic compounds. So typically you have to use slightly higher levels of rosemary extract and green tea and those types of plant extracted compounds to get similar levels of efficacy. And that's in part due to that lack of heat stability. So rosemary extract typically breaks down between 80 and 100 C. And so if you put that in pre-extrusion or pre-retort, it's going to be used up throughout processing because of that instability. So it's a great one. I really love to see rosemary in things like stabilizing chicken fat that goes on as a coating, but it still has some limitations compared to the efficacy you see with those chemically synthesized compounds. Hey, Tim, I think you're on mute.
There we go. Sorry, I had to take care of some other things and didn't want to hear my typing. Sorry about that. What kind of antioxidants are best suited for canned products? This is something that came in from our audience earlier.
Yeah, I love this question because when I worked at Mars about 6 years ago, I worked in wet product development. So oxidation and canned and wet pet food are some of my major passions. And this question actually took me back to my meat science days quite a bit because when I think about canned products, once the product is in a can and it goes into the retort, it's at fairly low risk of being oxidized because those cans or those trays have very low levels of oxygen compared to something like kibble in a bag that's going to be opened and exposed to oxygen for long periods of time. So in order to have the best prevention of oxidation in wet pet food products, you've got to really look at your raw material sources. Because the quality of that product that goes into the can and comes out of that retort is only as good as those raw materials that are going into the formulation. And that's where the oxidation is likely going to occur is somewhere between the meat processing plant and when you grind it and mix it and make your emulsion to go into that tray or can. And so thinking back just to my meat science days, I really like, first of all, how do you treat those blocks of frozen meat to reduce oxidation? I know that a lot of times this is byproduct coming out of the meat industry, but is there a way that you can get those meat suppliers to do some sort of antioxidant treatment before it goes into that frozen block process? That can be helpful just to have a layer of protection of antioxidant, natural, synthetic, whatever is acceptable for your label, going onto that frozen block. And then how do you treat those blocks of meat? Is there a way to reduce exposure to oxygen, to reduce the amount of light that they're exposed to? Can all make a really big difference in just the quality of that frozen block of meat. And then when I think about what can be done at the actual pet food processing facility, I really like the idea of using something like ascorbic acid or citric acid as a spray application during the grinding process or during the mixing process to make that canned food. And the reason I say that is in high moisture proteins, you're going to have a lot of those pro-oxidants, like your metal ions, that are moving freely throughout your product. And so those pro-oxidants are more likely to initiate that oxidation phase. And so when you've got that high moisture activity like you see in wet processing, I really like the idea of ascorbic acid or citric acid that helps bind up that oxygen, bind up those metal ions, and stop the process or slow that process from continuing. So that was a really long answer because, like I said, I really love canned pet food. It's one of my favorite topics, but I think you got to really think about your raw materials, and is there a way you treat and store those to maximize their quality? And then doing something like ascorbic acid or citric acid during the processing to definitely bring some benefit to prevent it from having some form of oxidation or rancidity development before it goes into the retort process.
Gotcha. Yeah, so that's everything anybody could want to know about antioxidants in canned products. Let's switch gears and talk about dry products. This is another question from the audience. What factors influence the effectiveness of an antioxidant in dry pet foods?
Yep. And this is another one. I work a lot with renderers, and I think they would probably be very angry at me for starting here. But it does start with the quality of that raw material going into your formulation. I mean, I say it a lot. You can't undo rancidity. And so, just like that tantrum that my protein's going to throw, you just don't want it to get started. And so that starts by making sure the raw materials coming from the rendering plant, whether that's your protein meals or your fats and oils, that they're stabilized correctly. Because if you put rancid chicken meal into a kibble formulation, you're going to likely get rancid product at the end that's going to have those shelf life concerns. Maybe immediately, maybe it won't show up until 6 months of shelf life, but you're going to see some concerns and that domino effect if you don't really put care into the specifications of your raw materials coming into your kibble formulation. The other thing that can really impact kibble formulation is just the fat content and the type of fat that is in that recipe. Omega-3s are great from a health and wellness standpoint, but they are going to be unsaturated, more likely to be attacked by those bonds are going to be attacked by those oxygen molecules, and they're going to be more susceptible to the rancidity process. So if you've got things like high levels of fish oil or flaxseed in a kibble formulation, you're probably going to want to look at your antioxidants a little differently and pick some with some added potency to help protect those susceptible fats that are found in that formulation. And then, like I talked a little bit, especially on the natural side of things, just the process of making kibble, extrusion, it's a hot process, right? And so you're going to degrade those antioxidant compounds during the production of the kibble. So I think it's important to put some antioxidant in during the mixing process to protect that kibble prior to extrusion. A lot of that antioxidant may get used up during that extrusion process, but then putting either your poultry or your fat coating that's going on that, having the right level of antioxidant in that to then give that overall protection where it's not going through another heat treated process so that you see that prolonged shelf life protection while it's in the bag.
Gotcha. So considering some of those considerations of the heat treatment and all that, what are some of the limitations to the current antioxidants used in pet food?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately the biggest is that our natural antioxidants aren't as great as the synthetic ones. I understand that consumers want the clean label, and there's a lot of, legit, sometimes pet health concerns related to those synthetic compounds, and they're definitely under regulatory scrutiny, but the natural antioxidants do have to be used at higher rates They're typically more expensive. And so in order to get that shelf life protection with clean labels, it's usually going to come at the cost of a higher recipe cost, higher price point to customers. So, the industry has to be willing to pay for those natural solutions because they're just not as efficacious as what you would see in synthetic compounds. And I think the other one that I think is a barrier in my mind is there's this conflicting priority. We want sustainability. So a lot of times from a packaging standpoint, that means you're taking out barrier layers in packaging, right? Those are the ones that aren't recyclable. And so sometimes with our packaging initiatives, we're actually setting our pet food products up to be more prone to oxidation because you're taking away some of those barriers. Because that's another way, even without antioxidants, no oxygen environments or low oxygen environments help prolong shelf life. And so I think that can be, a conflict there. And so we just have to figure out how we make sure we're still designing those antioxidants to give that prolonged protection, even if there is exposure to that oxygen during the shelf life.
Gotcha. Keep the oxygen out. So
Yep.
when we're talking about the different types of antioxidants, are they recipe specific, or is there one antioxidant that can fit all pet foods?
I think all the buyers out there would love for me to say it's a one size fits all. Just buy as much as you can of this one product. But this is an area I'm actually incredibly passionate about. Is it's not a one size fits all. And I actually think sometimes we do treat it that way. I'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about like emerging categories. But it probably, like, you may have a SKU of one brand of product. You may not be able to use the same antioxidant across all of those because beef is going to be a little different than fish, is going to be a little bit different than lamb. And so sometimes that's just changes in inclusion rates, but sometimes it really should be selecting a different antioxidant to bring added efficacy. So I'm going to give an example of that. I think most kibble formulations, like your chicken kibble that's out there on the shelf, typically perform pretty well with something like your mixed tocopherol and low rosemary blend that's out there from all the major antioxidant suppliers. But if I were working on a formulation that was high in fish oil or that had flaxseed and was really promoting that health and wellness benefit that comes with those higher omega-3s, then I would personally look at something like, we have a product called Oxygon Max within our portfolio, and it's got a different ratio of mixed tocopherols to rosemary. So it's got a little bit more of that rosemary that's going to be more synergistic. You're going to have more efficacy by just that slight tweak in that formulation. So I know that's a pain. Sourcing and operations don't want to have one antioxidant for these formulations and this one for another, but sometimes that's needed if there's some major differences in some of the fats in those formulations. And then another example is just the idea of these emerging categories like fresh and frozen. As I mentioned earlier, those typically have that higher level of water activity. So kibble's dry, right? I mean, we've gotten the moisture down, but some of those formats that are emerging that have that higher moisture content, things like that ascorbic acid or sodium ascorbate are going to help bind up those metal ions that are floating around in all that moisture and help stabilize those a bit better. So I wouldn't want to just copy and paste what we did in kibble for a fresh or frozen product. I'd really want to think about having a strategic blend that combats the specific challenges with those recipes.
Gotcha. So we've been talking a lot about the antioxidants themselves. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about how it plays out with the pets themselves. So how do antioxidants contribute to a pet's overall health beyond preventing rancidity?
Yep, and this one's a bit of a tricky one because we hear the word antioxidant, and right, our doctors tell us, you need a high level of antioxidants. It helps prevent cancer. It helps with your overall health. But typically the antioxidants that we're talking about that preserve lipids aren't necessarily the ones that are having the impact on the animal health and wellness. But I do like to start, we will get into some of that, but I like to start by saying that rancid product does have an animal health impact in itself. So by protecting those lipids, you're giving the food a better potential to provide the nutrition needed to have a healthy pet. And the reason I say that is if your omega 3s are being broken down through the oxidation process, they're no longer available to deliver that skin and coat or health and joint benefit. So we need to protect those fats that were put into the formulation for a reason, because otherwise they can't do their job to go protect that animal's health and give that quality of life. The other thing is that, lipid oxidation in itself can reduce the potency of some of those fat soluble vitamins, which is going to reduce potentially protein quality. And so once again, you designed this formulation with all the nutrition and nutrients that the animal needed, but you let oxidation destroy it. And then it's not delivering what that pet needs. And lastly, I would say, this is a very rare occurrence, but if product was incredibly rancid and your pet still chose to eat it, because a lot of times if rancidity becomes a true problem, they're just not going to eat it, which could be a problem in itself because then they're also not getting their food. But I've also seen my dog eat some pretty stale crackers like in the couch cushion. So let's say they eat some really rancid product. That can have some pet health benefits or negative pet health situations because those aldehydes and ketones, which are secondary products of oxidation, they can cause things like upset stomach and inflammation because they're not good for the animal. So it's not necessarily the typical answer where it's like eat blueberries and you won't have cancer, but these antioxidants that are used for lipid stabilization protect the nutrition that you built into those recipes so that you can have healthy pets.
Gotcha. So let's go into that a little bit more about safety concerns and how that plays out in the regulation world. So are there some safety concerns or restrictions on synthetic antioxidants like BHA, BHT, or ethoxyquin?
There are. And there's been quite a few studies out there. In general, a lot of these synthetic compounds have some sort of link to being a carcinogen at high levels. We see that in human food as well, right? We often see people scrutinizing human labels that have BHA or BHT in them because they are linked to being cancer causing, especially if you're consuming those in high doses. There's some specific studies with BHA where they've seen in rats and mice that those high doses of BHA may cause tumor growth and may lead to some liver changes. Somewhat similar with BHT, there's some rodent studies that show some mild liver and kidney changes when used at prolonged high doses. And there might even be some effect on thyroid function there. And then ethoxyquin is probably the one that gets the most scrutinized, where there are some studies that suggest long-term exposure may lead to some liver enzyme elevation and potentially attack red blood cells. And so all of those are kind of the worst case scenarios. But because we care and consumers care so much about their pets, that's often why these synthetic compounds get scrutinized, is because there are some studies out there that show those high doses or prolonged exposure could lead to some of those negative impacts. Now, in a healthy everyday dog, probably not a problem, but it's a risk a lot of people don't want to take when it comes to their pets.
Gotcha. Yeah, and one of the many hats that you wear is regulatory. So could you tell us a little bit about how AAFCO regulates the inclusion of antioxidants in pet food?
I can. I mean, I keep this AAFCO book on my desk. I have to reference it so often. I can't say regulatory is my expertise, but it's becoming my expertise. When I was at Mars, I had great regulatory people who like to just tell me, no, you can't put that on the label, and that works. But now I have to look it up in the book myself. But AAFCO does regulate antioxidants. They regulate the use, how you label it, the inclusion levels, all of those details, really to make sure we're being transparent to consumers, and we're not doing something that puts an animal at risk. That's why they have limits and certain ways that you need to label things. So there are some specific limits around synthetic, and I think we might get into that a little bit later. But for example, like the combined level of BHA and BHT can't exceed 200 ppm in fat or oil. So to help with what we just talked about, right, it's usually those high doses of those synthetic compounds that cause pet health concerns. ASCO tells us you can use them, but use them within these limitations, because that's where we think it's safe to not have that animal negative health impact. The other thing that they require is that transparency piece that I mentioned. And so mixed tocopherols, when you see them on pet labels, will typically have in parentheses preservatives that go along with it. And that's to tell the consumer, hey, this is put in there, and it's put in there to protect the shelf life of the product. So it's just a way to bring that transparency. There's not limits on mixed tocopherols and rosemary extract from an inclusion level standpoint. They just want to make sure you're depicting the why those are in the formulation. But there is one like little caveat to that. Things like rosemary extract and green tea extract, they can be called natural flavor, or they can be considered a flavoring, because, I mean, rosemary, right? We use rosemary to season steaks sometimes. So we know that it can carry a flavor profile as well. So sometimes you may see rosemary on a label and it doesn't have that parentheses of preservative. So like most things, it's not black and white, but ASCO does give us some pretty decent regulations on how we label our antioxidants on our pet food label.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was going to ask a little bit more about the labeling requirements, but pretty much covered it right there. So let's actually look at, that's in the U.S. with AFCO, of course. But so how are regulatory requirements for using antioxidants in pet food or labeling them different between the U.S. and Europe or other countries or other areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think Europe's the most relevant one to talk about. Our European friends are typically a little more strict when it comes to pet food labeling and the levels of acceptable inclusions of some of these antioxidant compounds. And that trickles over, right? A lot of pet food is exported to European countries. So even though AFCO doesn't tell us that we have to follow these guidelines, a lot of times we just do in the United States to make sure we protect the ability to export that product to other countries. So I'll give a couple of examples here. Ethoxyquin that I mentioned, great antioxidant. It's banned in the EU. They don't allow it at all. No, none allowed in the product. In the US, we can technically use it up to 150 ppm in fat or 75 ppm in the finished food. But since Europe doesn't allow it, it's completely banned. There's not, I can't think of a pet food company that's using ethoxyquin. It's been eliminated as a synthetic antioxidant. And then from the standpoint of BHA and BHT, they're actually pretty similar between the EU and our AFCO or US regulations. The EU limit is 150 ppm in the completed food, and it's 200 ppm in the fat per AFCO. So those are fairly similar. In Europe, there is a little more scrutiny of BHA because, as I mentioned, there's some of those mouse studies that they're correlating, and there's some cat data that brings some concern with BHA. So BHA gets a little more scrutiny from EU as well. So that's mainly on the synthetic side of things. On the natural side, there's not a whole lot of major differences. EU likes those, right? They're clean label. And so once we move out of that synthetic category, it gets a little easier just to follow the US standard.
Gotcha. So considering some of the labeling considerations for the US and EU, pet food or pet owners are looking for a clean label. They don't necessarily want to see a large chemical name on their product. How is that demand, or is that shaping demand for natural antioxidants in formulation trends?
Yeah, I mean, as we mentioned, I mean, it's a challenge. We actually see a lot of pet food companies asking for longer shelf life, but make sure you use the clean label solution. So honestly, I'm not complaining because that makes my job hard, fun, and keeps me employed because it's great challenges for us to solve as an industry that we keep coming up with these natural compounds that can fight against the oxidation that occurs in those pet food formulations and for an extended period of time. I think a lot of what this has led us to as a antioxidant industry is to really look at that synergistic blend because there's really not a one-to-one compound replacement. Like I would never tell someone just take BHT out and put mixed tocopherols in. It's not going to work. So it's pushed us in the natural space to figure out what are those synergistic blends that can deliver what we were seeing in the synthetic compounds that were used 10, 15 years ago before we had this strong push to clean label solutions. And then, as I mentioned, I think it's really pushing our renderers and our raw material suppliers to do a better job of stabilizing their products so that less of the pressure is on those pet food companies. Because once the rancidity starts, you're not gonna combat that. So I think this push for natural antioxidants has really pushed it even farther back up the supply chain because that's where we have to control it, and we have to control it with those natural solutions.
Gotcha. Well, so I'm actually going to jump ahead now and kind of talk a little bit about or go into a little bit more about what you were just saying about there, some of those innovations and moving forward. And then we'll get into some questions from the audience because we've only got 20 minutes and a whole bunch of questions. So if you could talk about what some of those advances or innovations that are coming forward, maybe give us a little preview of antioxidant research, how it could influence pet food formulation in coming years.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm going to call out, and I'm probably opening up a soapbox that I maybe don't want to, but I think just looking futuristic, something that we have to do as an industry is have a standardized way that we are looking at how we measure oxidation. Like I said, it could be an entire talk talking about PV and secondary compounds and what should we be measuring and the reliability of those. But it's hard for us as an industry to develop great antioxidants when we don't know what we're measuring to call it success. And so there's quite a bit of work being done with the Pet Food Alliance to try to come up with standardized PV method for both the extraction process that's needed for rendered proteins and kibble type products, and then the actual PV measurement, because there's a whole lot of different ways that you can do that out there. And so I think as an industry, there's research being done there, and that's incredibly important so that we know what we're developing against. And I always ask my team, okay, what's the criteria for success for this trial? So we need to be able to define that. And then where I think the industry is going, I actually love the word upcycle. I love it a whole lot more than sustainability because I think it's a more meaningful word to talk about really where we can make an impact in the pet food industry. And so there is a focus on how do we get new compounds that are coming from the co-products from the human food industry. So an example of just one that's kind of out there on the list is how can you get grapeseed extract from winemaking, and can you turn that into an antioxidant that has potency similar to mixed tocopherols and rosemary. Looking at citrus flavonoids that come from juice production, or I've heard of polyphenols from olive oil production. And so that's going to be a focus, I think, with the push for sustainability and us still needing new compounds, because I do think at some point it won't all just be mixed tocopherols and rosemary. So what are those new compounds that also play into that upcycle story? And then the last one that I'll mention that I get excited about is the idea of multifunctional or bundled benefits. We talked a little bit about the health and wellness. I mean, wouldn't we all love if you put this antioxidant in and it not only stabilizes fat, but it also does give you those health and wellness benefits? Or if you had one ingredient that does the entire shelf life protection, it helps with mold, it helps with microbial, it helps with biogenic amines, it helps with lipid oxidation. And so I think there's going to be a push for how do pet food companies buy the one ingredient that's kind of their silver bullet on things. I'd love to solve it. I don't know if I'm smart enough, but I think it's where we could go as an industry to make it easier for pet food manufacturers.
Gotcha. A little glimpse of antioxidants to come. Looking for that silver bullet. So we're going to switch now and take some questions from the audience. We've got a whole bunch of them here and try and get through them in the next 18 minutes or so. Let's see what topics are on the minds of pet food professionals. We have one question here from a person who has a customer who wants a single ingredient product, a dried or a dehydrated carp product, but they want to make it a single ingredient. How can a producer offer a single ingredient product without an antioxidant or preservative? How does that work out in terms of regulation?
That's a really hard one to do, especially when you're thinking about fish type products that are prone to oxidation. I mean, ultimately, you would have to look at your raw material source and see if there's things that you can do to manipulate the stability of that product before it actually goes into the pet food ingredient. And then there are sometimes some workarounds depending on your regulatory program of things that could be considered processing aids that may not show up on the label that can offer some antioxidant or some oxidation protection. So super tricky one, not an easy one to solve, but you'd really have to look at the raw material and how you're protecting it through the supply chain and maintaining that, putting it in a low oxygen environment for packaging, and then potentially looking at things that could be considered processing aids and deliver some of that oxidation protection.
Gotcha. So getting a little bit more into the antioxidants there, what are some factors that actually cause the formation of the free radicals of the fats and oils?
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately what causes the reaction is you've got those unsaturated bonds that have the ability for oxygen to come in and attack those and peel off that free radical. So ultimately, it's just the nature of having polyunsaturated fatty acids in a formulation. And then you'll have things like metal ions that initiate that cause that to start. So those are the big things. I mean, oxygen and unsaturated fatty acids are going to put you in a situation where that oxidation and those free radicals will want to form.
Gotcha. So you had mentioned a little bit about sustainability and how that plays into the antioxidant market and upcycling. Could you maybe mention a little bit more about how, not even necessarily looking towards the future, but how right now a company can use antioxidants as part of their sustainability strategy?
Yeah, I do, like I said, love this whole upcycling. I mean, I like to upcycle things in my house. I'm the one who reuses the gift bags over and over, right? So I think that's a great place that we promote sustainability, is continuing as a pet food industry to think about what are co-products from human food that we don't let go to waste. We figure out a way to make those beneficial. And I think there's some antioxidants that can come from that. I also think there's a story of us having better shelf life protected products. So non-traditional way of thinking, but if our product doesn't go rancid and get thrown away, that's a sustainability story. If our shelf life gets compromised and we end up having to throw away a bunch of pet food, like that's waste. And so I think that's another way that we can just talk about how antioxidants play into that sustainability story.
Right, waste not, want not. Let's see. There's a question here about, are some of the examples of natural antioxidants that you gave before, are all of those approved as antioxidants in pet food?
Not everything is approved as an antioxidant. Like I mentioned, rosemary is often considered a flavor, not a preservative when you look at the ASCO book. Regulatory teams are going to look at some of that a little bit differently company to company, because it's not quite as black and white as I'd like ASCO to be. But that is a call out. Sometimes we're using things that are natural flavors, are flavoring compounds, but they're eliciting some antioxidant response in the product.
Gotcha. And then in terms of, well, actually, there's two questions here about natural antioxidants, so I'll try and combine them. When using a natural antioxidant, could you talk a little bit about how the temperature affects them during production? And it kind of ties into this next one here about needing higher levels of natural antioxidants and their effectiveness compared to synthetics.
Yep. I mean, I'll start with the effectiveness conversation. I think we can get there. I mean, there's success stories all across the industry. I mean, pick up most pet food bags now at PetSmart. They don't have BHA and BHT on them. A lot of them are saying that natural mixed coffee, rosemary. And so I think we can. Synthetic is easier. It's cheaper. They last longer. Like, it's obviously the easy button. Synthetics are the easy button when it comes to oxidation protection, but we've figured it out with natural antioxidants. And I think as an industry, we're going to continue to get better because pet food companies are pushing us to. They don't want me as an antioxidant supplier just say, just add more of whatever I've already given you. They want us to come up with those efficacious solutions. So I think we'll get there. Will we get there in every single product in every single scenario? Probably. It might just take longer. But the idea of the efficacy, I mean, the reality is a lot of the natural compounds are broken down with heat. They're not as heat resistant as you would find with BHA, especially BHA, but BHA and BHT. So I think it's still important. This is a Melissa opinion, but I still think it's important to put antioxidants pre-extrusion, potentially pre-retort, pre that heat step to protect those lipids prior to the heat process, but knowing they're probably going to be broken down during that process, lose some of their efficacy. So that coating step can be really important, or just the oxygen barrier packaging or whatever else you can do at the end to deliver protection, because we do know those natural compounds are going to get degraded some during that heat process.
Gotcha. So I guess after the fact, once they've been heat treated and all that, what are some the pros and cons associated with evaluations like T-bars, PV, and P-anisodine?
Yep. I see Nathan ask that question too. I really like Nathan. He's a great guy. But they're very important. And that's what I was talking about. How do we standardize what we're using? I'll try not to go on too big of a tangent, but I hate doing just PV because the reality is PV is a bell-shaped curve. And you could have a product that's rancid and it's got a low PV value because it's already been through that curve. So PV alone, I think it works really good at the beginning of shelf life, but at the end may not tell us the full picture of that product. So I really like to pair PV with a secondary compound. P-anisodine is good. I mean, aldehyde is good. I feel like there's a push in the industry to go towards hexanol. I think it's good as well. I don't really care which secondary, as long as you're looking at that complete picture of a PV and a secondary. And what I mean by that secondary is those are the compounds that are produced after the rancidity. Those are the things that are creating those off flavors and off aromas. And so I really care how high are those, because that's what's going to start being off-putting to the consumers and to the pets is once you get to those oxidation byproducts. So I think they can all work. I think as an industry, a lot of times we have to look at cost and how rapid, right? I mean, the poultry mill facilities out there don't have time for a 10-day turnaround on a PV value. So we've got to look at those accelerated methods that allow, instant results or quick results for us to then make decisions from there.
Gotcha. Here's a pretty specific one. What is the inclusion level of HBA?
Of HBA. I actually don't know what that question is asking. I'll just be completely honest.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, I'm not sure myself either. So so I mentioned earlier the use of, like, for humans, we'll put rosemary on our steaks and things like that. How does that play out for pets? Do any of the natural antioxidants offer any flavor or palatability benefits?
I think they can. I'll be honest, the skeptic in me thinks that like rosemary that's in a kibble formulation probably isn't a high enough level to elicit a major flavor difference. But I definitely think as you look at, inclusion levels and how you're applying and where you're applying some of those antioxidants, there could be some flavor impact. And especially as we start thinking about maybe some of the futuristic ones, maybe we'll see more flavor impact as we look at some of those other botanical type extracts. So long story short, yes, I think they can. Do I think they do often? It really just depends on the inclusion level.
So getting into some of the kind of chemical nitty gritty here, I have a question if you could address the sacrificial modes and oxygen scavenger modes of oxidation reduction on HUFAs.
I don't know if I completely understand what that question is
Sure.
asking either. I'm failing at the Q&A part of this, so.
Not a problem. No, you're doing great. I don't know what it means either. So, does oxidation cause color change in the final product?
Color change, something near and dear to my heart. It can, and a lot of color changes come from the more of the color oxidation process, which deals with things like myoglobin. Like I said, that goes back to my meat science days where I spent a lot of time in a meat color chemistry lab. So there can be changes in color. I know when I was in the wet pet food space, sometimes you'll open a can and it will look a certain color and then it'll kind of gray or look different over time. And that's coming from oxygen penetrating that surface. Myoglobin wasn't completely broken down, and you're seeing some of those color changes. So lipid oxidation can do a little bit of that, but a lot of times the color changes you see are a different mode of action, which are related to the myoglobin or color oxidation process.
Gotcha. Here's another chemistry one. Can an antioxidant in a high concentration act as a pro-oxidant?
It can actually. And that's why when people say, hey, just add more, I'm like, pause. How about we actually just look for compounds that work better? Because at some point there can be an oversaturation of those antioxidant compounds and they end up becoming a pro-oxidant, and you don't see added benefit of adding more. You actually may see negative benefit of continuing to add more, especially of mixed tocopherols. I think that's the most common instance where I see that negative effect with going too high with those compounds.
Gotcha. So we had a question here about pomegranate extract and what you think of that in terms of use along with rosemary or in comparison to it.
Yep. I think that's a good call out on this. There are some really good compounds out there. I like pomegranate. I like green tea, but they aren't very soluble in oil matrix sometimes. And so I really like the idea of using some of these compounds that are kind of up and coming, but we do have to figure out how do we put those in a solution and actually apply those to typically a fat, right? Because that's usually what we're looking to stabilize. Are those fats. And so it takes some emulsion technology to just make sure that we can suspend those and actually deliver them into the product so that they can have the benefit that we've intended them to have.
Gotcha. So we talked a little bit about some of the labeling requirements for those natural antioxidants. If that antioxidant doesn't have a GRAS certification or a CFR citation for its antioxidant function, what are the regulatory labeling limitations for a natural antioxidant in pet food?
Yeah, I mean, if it's not defined in the ASCO book, right? If it's not on the natural flavor list or it's not GRAS and identified as an antioxidant, then it really can't be used. It's got to be something that's approved for use on a label. So if it's something unique that hasn't been looked at by ASCO, then it's something that would have to go through the full regulatory approval process. There'd have to be the animal studies to understand, is there an impact to the animal? Thankfully, thankfully, there's a lot of places that antioxidant compounds show up within the ASCO book, and so sometimes you can put it on the label. It just doesn't necessarily fall underneath that antioxidant category in the definition.
Gotcha. And we have another question here about assessing the oxidation or within the pet foods themselves. What tests are available and what are the pros and cons of each type of test? And are there some labs you can mention that offer them?
Yeah, I can. I mean, one, a lot of times your antioxidant supplier, at least I know we do, offer some of those lab services. So if you're buying antioxidants from us, send your samples in. We can do these tests for you, kind of as a business partner on that side of things. Midwest Labs is another one that I use quite a bit. Tyson has some really good labs that do some third party work as well. And then, yeah, Eurofins is the big guy out there. I really like, well, it depends on what you're doing. If you're looking at a shelf life study and it's research and you're really wanting to validate your oxidation status of your product, the AOCS PV method is the best. It's going to be the most reliable, even though there's some differences between that one. But I'd use those over the rapid methods like CDR and Safe Test. And then, like I said, I'd pick one of those secondary, and they'd really be based on your product. If you picked aldehyde or pianisidine or hexanol, and then free fatty acids is another good one that can be ran as well to give you an overlook at how your product is doing.
Gotcha. So if that product doesn't do particularly well, what are the potential negative health effects on an animal consuming pet food with a high level of antioxidant or of oxidation, excuse me? Or is the concern mainly around the decreased palatability and off aromas and things like that?
It's mainly around the decreased palatability. I think I mentioned it earlier. Really high levels can cause some health impacts, such as digestive upset, or inflammation in the animal, but typically you're going to reach a point of rejection before you get to what I would call those more toxic type levels. And the biggest thing is, can you imagine? I mean, I know if I went to my pantry right now and I opened my pet food and it smelled rancid, I'm just to me, the consumers, or the pet parents matter a lot, because they're going to be really mad that they paid $100 for that bag of pet food and it smells terrible and their dog or cat doesn't want to eat it.
Right, right. Here's a pretty straightforward one. Is selenium a kind of antioxidant?
It can be in some form. Like that's a good call out. It can help bind some of those metal chelators that are pro-oxidant. So it can have a beneficial effect in a formulation.
Gotcha. Another pretty specific one. Which antioxidants work best in a semi-moist product with a water content between 20 to 30%?
Yeah. In that sort of scenario, I think the blends, right, using potentially mixed tocopherols, rosemary, and then I would add in like a citric acid or an ascorbic acid to help with that higher moisture level and the way the compounds are moving around in that formulation compared to the dry one. So I would do a synergistic blend of some of your natural compounds and then some of those acids that can bring benefit.
So a little bit more about the natural antioxidants. Are there some palatability studies available for the use of rosemary or green tea antioxidants, I guess, depending on their level? And also, is there information about the degradation rate over time for vitamin A in relation to natural preservative inclusion rates?
Yes, there are some really good studies out there. I don't really want to try to regurgitate them right now, but if someone wanted to follow up with me afterward, I can definitely point them to some of those studies that can give guidance on that.
Gotcha. Let's see here. Sorbic acid is in the presence of a high sorbic acid can act as a pro-oxidant in the presence of a high iron solution. How do you determine when it would be beneficial to include ascorbic acid?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that you have to look at your entire nutrition profile and understand if you think you've got available iron that could interact with that ascorbic acid and potentially turn it from a good to a bad solution. And that's why I say it's not a one size fits all. I can't just say every recipe should have this in it. You've really got to look at the different nutrients and profile of that recipe to make the decision, because too much of something can be a bad thing. And so just making sure that you balance that out.
Gotcha. So we'd mentioned pomegranates as a natural antioxidant before. How about olive extract as a natural antioxidant?
Mm-hmm. I've seen quite a bit of research in that space. Of actually, in general, olive is kind of a up and coming trendy thing, and so yes, it's got antioxidant potential, and it definitely would meet that natural standpoint. Upcycle all the good things that we talked about. I don't think I've actually seen it used in the industry yet, but it's something that's for sure on the radar of a lot of people.
Well, let's see. How about, do you see differences in antioxidant reactions when considering wet in can or versus a product? Oh, I see. A wet product in a can versus a product in a tray.
Yes, there can be some differences there. It goes back to that conversation of permeability of the packaging. Cans are a fantastic oxygen barrier. Naturally, they're gonna keep more oxygen out than you see in some of the trays. Especially, like I said, as we've gone towards this sustainability pathway, a lot of times it's those barriers that they're pulling out of the tray product, which may make them susceptible for more oxygen permeating into the product.
Gotcha. And so let's see, we have one here about, oops, sorry, just lost it a second. There we go. So we have one here. How do you feel about citric acid, I guess, as a chelator for HUFAs?
I like citric acid. We have quite a few formulations within our portfolio that use citric acid. So I think it does have some benefit from that chelating standpoint. I definitely don't think it's a silver bullet by any means, but used in combination with those synergistic blends can really just be another added layer of protection.
Gotcha. Okay. And sorry, we're running a little over time. Are you still okay on time here?
I am.
Okay. You still got questions pouring in. So what do you think about determining oxidation through volatiles and its application in the pet food industry?
Yeah, I mean, those volatiles are what I was talking about of those secondary compounds. That's another word for those, the aldehydes, the ketones, those sorts of things that are produced as byproducts. And I think they're incredibly important because TV doesn't tell the whole story. And what I really care about is, are those volatiles produced that are then causing the negative aroma and flavor? So when I do research, I always look at some of those volatile compounds. There's different ways that you can do that testing. There's some rapid methods, there's some GCMS methods. So I think there's a lot of different options, but it's definitely something, especially when you're doing research and looking at shelf life, that should be included.
Gotcha. So this is a pretty specific one about which antioxidants are best or most suitable for saturated fats versus unsaturated fats.
Well, I mean, your saturated fats are naturally going to be less prone to oxidation. So you could choose some that maybe aren't as efficacious at that point. But when you start having those unsaturated fats, that's where you're really going to want to look at your more efficacious blends, because they're going to be harder to stabilize. Those fats are going to be harder to stabilize.
Gotcha. We talked a little bit before about too much of a good thing. Is there any actual regulation on natural antioxidant inclusion limit?
I don't believe per ASCO that there are regulatory limits. Some companies do set some limits on things like green tea, or rosemary extract based on like the carnosic acid content. Once again, there could be negative health impacts on animals if it's a really high level. Green tea can carry some caffeine depending on the green tea source that you're using. So a lot of times individual companies may set some internal limits. And there are some limits if you're calling it, natural flavor. Sometimes there's inclusion levels that you have to look at.
Gotcha. Here's a good chemistry question. When we're considering free metal ions in high moisture products, it'd be like fresh, frozen, or gently cooked, does the format of the metals change the approach to antioxidant choice? For example, oxides versus amino acid chelates versus proteinates.
It can. I think honestly, we haven't done a ton of work in that area. A lot of times we just say, use a chelator, and those are the ascorbic acids or the citric acids. And we're just hoping they work because those are the tools that we've most identified. But it definitely can impact the efficacy of that chelation process based on the form of those ions.
Gotcha. So I appreciate you being able to stay a little extra time, Melissa. We're getting close to 10 over, so I'm gonna go ahead and call it. And also mention that if people do want to follow up on these questions, do please follow up with Wilbur Ellis. I'm sure they can help you and put you in contact with Melissa. Those are some great questions, but as I said, we're running out of time. Sorry we can't get them all. Did you have any final thoughts? Anything you wanted to mention, Melissa?
No, just that. Feel free to reach out, especially if I didn't answer some of your questions today. I love talking to people. I love helping you find solutions. And so reach out to me, reach out to Wilbur Ellis. It's been a joy speaking to you today.
Awesome. And thanks again, Melissa, and thank you to our audience. We'd greatly appreciate your feedback out on our chat today. So please scan the QR code that you should now be able to see to access the survey. We'll email a survey link soon as well. I'd like to give a big thank you to Wilbur Ellis Nutrition for sponsoring this edition of Pet Food Pro. Please watch for more Ask the Pet Food Pro chats brought to you by Pet Food Industry and Pet Food Forum. I'm Tim Wall, Senior Reporter for Pet Food Industry, and I'd like to say thanks again to Dr. Melissa Weber, Director of Technical Sales and FSQR at Wilbur Ellis Nutrition. And also a big thanks to our Watt Global Media staff for making this all possible. Thanks to our international audience for joining us. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day or evening, depending on which hemisphere you call home. So until next time on Ask the Pet Food Pro, goodbye.